This is a justification for the entailment Nautiloid subclass of atypical cephalopod, and it comes from the Nautilus ontology. Let's ask for a justification-oriented proof for this justification. Here's our proof, and it starts with the entailment Nautiloid subclass of atypical cephalopod. Why is this the case? Well, we've asserted in our ontology that Nautiloid is a subclass of cephalopod. We know this is asserted because it doesn't have a triangle next to it. And then we have two lemmas. These are automatically derived by the framework. We can tell it's got a triangle next to it in this presentation. And the first one is Nautiloid subclass of not typical cephalopod. And anything that's a cephalopod and is not a typical cephalopod is a subclass of atypical cephalopod. So these three axioms are justification for Nautiloid subclass of atypical cephalopod. Why is it the case that Nautiloid is a subclass of not typical cephalopod? Because this hasn't been asserted, this is derived, it's a lemma. Well, actually Nautiloid is disjoint with typical cephalopod. This is just a rephrasing of this jointness axiom here. Why is Nautiloid disjoint with typical cephalopod? This is entailed as well. Well, we've asserted in the ontology that Nautiloid is a subclass of has shell sum yes. But we also derive that typical cephalopod is disjoint with things that have shell sum yes. So typical cephalopod must be disjoint with Nautiloid, as we see. Why is typical cephalopod disjoint with has shell sum yes? Well, a typical cephalopod is a subclass of has shell sum no. We've asserted that has shell is functional, which means that we can only have one has shell relationship. And we've also asserted in the ontology that no is disjoint with yes. So typical cephalopod must be disjoint with things that have shell sum yes, because a typical cephalopod has shell sum no. Why is this the case? Well, typical cephalopod is equivalent to cephalopod and has shell sum no. We've actually said this in our ontology. So these entail that Nautiloid is a subclass of not typical cephalopod. And why is anything that's a cephalopod and not a typical cephalopod an atypical cephalopod? Well, there's just one axiom in our ontology that's been asserted. Atypical cephalopod is equivalent to cephalopod and not typical cephalopod. So our asserted axioms entail these lemmas, and together these lemmas entail the entailment of interest. That's our justification was for. Nautiloid is a subclass of atypical cephalopod.